Good afternoon, and welcome to a fireside chat with David Blake. I'm going to start out by saying that David Blake is one of my favorite people in the world. He's a fantastic entrepreneur who I backed after, I think, the first meeting, first seeing your vision for an extraordinarily successful company called Degreed. David decided to move up, retire to executive chairman of Degreed last year in an incredibly smooth transition with your dear friend and co-founder, Chris McCarthy. And he has taken the quite extraordinary and ambitious step of running for vice president. And as when I tell people that David's my dear friend and person I admire hugely is running for vice president, the next question is usually, of what? So with that, David, you've done a lot of work on this. Can you explain to the crowd how it's possible to run for the vice president of the United States, how you decided to do this, and what you're trying to achieve in this campaign?
Yeah, I think, starting with why, and something I don't think I've ever really shared with you, so much of my life has been driven by education. That was the goals and the mission of my life. And some point along the way, my daughter asked me if Americans hated each other this much when I was a kid. And, it really began to orient me seriously to what is going on. And, and so it pulled me into, and I try and not fall in love with solutions, but try and fall in love with a problem. And then just try and understand and be sort of oriented to what is the best way we can make a difference. Which is
the way you built Degreed.
It is, yeah. And, Deborah mentioned she invested after one meeting, but, it was very similar because back then I didn't know what the solution was. I came to you and I said, we're a search party. Here's the problem. And we are going to fix it, but I don't know what it's going to look like. We're just sort of rooting around in the leaves right now. And you said, I love it. What drew me into this? Hyperpartisanship, this division that we are feeling. And I believe in a two-party democracy, we can't afford to govern by doing and undoing every 4 years.
Right.
To be competitive in this two-party democracy, these 4-year terms, when we're competing with a China who can have a 40-year administration, we've got to be moving forward every 4 years. And we're not right now. And what drew me to this was the founding fathers. They had to anticipate all the ways democracy might break. And the check and balance they gave us on divided government was the vice presidency. And so I started exploring and learning and researching and starting to reach out to people. Here's sort of the bottom line, what I discovered. The 12th Amendment of the Constitution, it gives us the right to elect the vice president. It calls for a distinct list and a distinct ballot for the election of the vice president. And here we are, and we've lost it. And so we'll talk a little bit about it, but we already have this right. And so this is really about just standing up, reclaiming this office that was created to be the check and balance on divided government. And it's really a chance to create a unifier in chief, to use this office as a domestic diplomat in a time of division.
How do you get on the ballot?
Yeah, it's actually good news. Look, this reform, as compared to other things, right now we've heard some musings in the news about the Electoral College. Some people want to get rid of the Electoral College. That is so hard, so hard. You have to have 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states to ratify. The good news about this is we already have the 12th Amendment, and that is our truth. We don't just ignore our amendments. Because of the 12th Amendment, the Electoral College already votes separately for president and vice president. The one place it's gotten sort of mixed up is the parties co-opting the office, creating a slate and then a ticket, and on the ballot. That's the one place this choice is sort of no longer available to us. But the good news is that even ballot access laws reflect the 12th Amendment. And so in every state, there's laws about how a vice president gets on the ballot. So that's what we have to do, is we have to get signatures in every state. With the signatures, you get on the ballot in 2020, and that's what gives us this opportunity when we go to vote in 2020, instead of having Hillary Clinton, Tim Kaine, one checkbox, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, one checkbox, that we'll be able to vote for president, and then separately, as it calls for in the 12th Amendment, vote for our vice president.
Fascinating. So play this out for me. You end up with a Democrat and a Republican, and they have vice presidential candidates. So you will effectively be running against their vice presidential candidates, or is there some hope on your part that one of the leads from the parties would actually choose to go with you? How?
Yeah. I'm a registered independent. And, first I would say the 12th Amendment is our constitutional right, no matter what your politics are. This office is ours, no matter what your politics are. And it's worth thinking about, and it's worth remembering that. My politics, I'm a registered independent. And I believe this office is particularly well suited to that role of being a unifier, but even further, a chance at coalition building in a government where we have very few chances of coalition building. And what I didn't appreciate when I came into this, I knew that I felt sort of disaffected by the parties. And I had some friends that sort of, talked as I did or sounded like their concerns were similar. But when I started studying this, what I didn't appreciate, 2012 is when America crossed over. Since 2012, we now have more registered independents than we have registered Republicans or registered Democrats. And that is not something we're hearing talked about. That is not something that's in sort of the media narrative right now. But America is roughly about 25% Republican, sort of roughly about 30% Democrat, and sort of roughly about 40% registered independents. So what's happened is increasingly, independents, we don't have real voice in this two-party system, and there's a growing number. And so I think this office is a chance for to bring a broader coalition to the executive branch of government. So yes, we could compete. We can get on the ballot as an independent and compete with the parties, but then you also made reference to, well, would one of the major party candidates ever be interested in an independent? And I don't know that they are yet, but we've seen calls for unity tickets. But when you think about that math, just think about that for a moment. If a major party candidate were to pull an independent onto the ticket, it arguably is an overwhelming coalition and could guarantee then sort of a winning coalition.
You almost take us towards a parliamentary type.
A little bit,
yeah.
A little bit. It's that coalition approach, and we have very few chances at coalitions.
It's fascinating. So what power does a vice president have to begin with? Is it allocated, or is it actually very clearly defined or clearly defined? And then talk a little bit about your platform, at least when you and I first talked about this. I mean, what is going to be your voice?
Sure.
What do you hope to be your voice?
Yeah, so to take the first part, what are the powers of the vice president? And there's a few. But in the Constitution, what is outlined? They are the president of the Senate, so they are the senior-most legislator. They are the first in line of succession, so they, and sort of the evolution of how we use the office, they've really become then the number 2 sort of junior executive in the executive branch. Then they have a few sort of clerical duties, but then the hard power is really in the tie-breaking vote. So they are the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. When I talk about the vice presidency being a check and balance on divided government, it's really that power. And the vice presidency was created at our founding before we had political parties. So they weren't anticipating red versus blue. They were anticipating north versus south, east versus west. And should we ever get drawn evenly to a tie, they knew the president would be sitting in Virginia. And they felt that was unfair to cede a tie to the president because just by default, he'd be on one side or the other. Now she. But Now, it's really this partisan divide. But they invested that power in its own office to be a check and balance on division, on the executive branch, to be the national leader who gets to decide how we move forward should we get stuck. And so, when we're working together, that power matters almost not at all. When our two parties are getting along, when our system of government, as designed, is high functioning, this office's hard power sort of goes away. It doesn't matter. It never comes to a tie. But we are highly divided, and this office matters in times of division. And as evidence of that, Mike Pence, in 2 years, has cast more tie-breaking votes than any vice president, those who served 8 years included, since 1841. Mike Pence is determining an outsized amount of our legislation, and none of us got to pick him. To answer the second question, so my platform, my ideas. So first, I'm not a declared candidate. This is something I've given consideration to, the FEC. You have to be careful with some of those later. So I am considering this. But, look, I will say this one quickly. I had a phone call with the Ministry of Education for a country I will leave unnamed while I was at this conference. And it really made me sad. It really made me quite sad. Because they were talking about future-proofing their citizenry. They were talking about how we invest in the skills of the future, how we create a resilient workforce, how we deploy education that will map to the future. And it just leaves me thinking, this isn't a conversation we are having now. We here are having those conversations. That conversation has gotten buried so far beneath the wall, taxes, healthcare, things that matter. But it's gotten buried, and we're not having it, and it matters because others are. So that's really my consideration, my expertise, and what I hope that we are talking about in our politics this cycle and for the next, 10 years.
So would you envision it being a vice president sort of very clearly aligned with the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, or something completely different?
Yeah, one of the critiques that I've gotten in this is that history essentially fought so hard to pull the vice presidency from irrelevance to relevance. It went from being funeral director to being something that matters. And a valid critique is, well, and the reason the vice presidency is relevant is Walter Mondale gave America a new version of the vice president. One that sits in the White House, one that meets with the president, one that gets all of the executive briefings that the president gets. And that proximity created relevance. And so people say, well, if the presidents aren't getting to pick their running mate, are you going to roll back 60 years of history and progress? No, not calling to roll back the vice presidency. Walter Mondale gave us a model of the vice presidency that gave America more, that was fit for its time. And we shouldn't let that good model of the vice presidency be what keeps us from using it now as a solution for our times. And the model of the vice presidency that I'm calling for is first a unifier in chief, a domestic diplomat. It is uniquely suited to that. It's the only office in our entire government that sits in two branches of government, the legislative and the executive. And it is that sort of proverbial bridge now with that tie-breaking vote between our two parties. So first, a model of unifier in chief. Second, get something done. We've done national surveying, we have done focus groups. I've been in 5 states in the last 8 days, talked to now hundreds, now thousands of people. If you ask people, and I will challenge you guys, name something a sitting vice president has done to the benefit of the American people. And you might come up with something. Is anyone eager to raise their hand? We can get more from this office. This is 50% of our elected federal representatives. We can get more from this office. So yes, the second part of it, get something done. Focus on labor, on education, on workforce.
So one question that I had really from the first time we talked is you want to be the unifier in chief, so you want to be independent, not biased. Now, which is lovely, but education is very political, right? So jobs I get. The jobs part of it's not much political about that. People need effective jobs and to make a living. How do you deal with the inherently political issues that underlie the improvement, the drastic improvements that we need in education?
One thought really quick, which is education, higher education in particular, is what you see mostly surveyed and polled on, has benefited from broad bipartisan support in America largely for the last 75, 80 years. And we are starting to see that diverge. We are starting to see partisan difference in our support of education, and that scares me. 15 years ago, global warming, climate change, was a far less partisan issue, and then one of our parties picked it up, well-intentioned, but picked it up in such a way that it drove a wedge. And I'm really quite fearful that we could be at risk of a party picking up education in the wrong way that serves only to drive a wedge. Now, the way I've tried to navigate this is to not, we sort of have right now calls for free university. We have sort of school choice. Those are maybe some of the more stereotypically partisan positions. Avoiding it altogether. Like, we're just quagmired there. And we shouldn't let that now be the enemy of progress. The things I am calling for are new ideas that aren't yet, at least, co-opted by either the left or the right. A quick example, and this won't sound as foreign to this audience, but this is something no one's ever thought about sort of broadly. I believe we need to move to credential every semester of higher education. Make them stackable. It'll do two things immediately. With a 45% dropout rate, that's about 12 million students annually that'll complete about 100 million courses and spend about $100 billion on tuition, who drop out, who after time and a half never get the degree that they are seeking. We should be credentialing that education so that you don't have to worry about transfers, so that you can come back and just start stacking. Second thing that does overnight is it gives us a lifelong model of higher education. Right now it's binary, it's all or nothing. We pull you in, we make it intense, we make it sort of, it's just all or nothing. And so the on-ramp and off-ramp, it's this very high barrier. If every credential, I could segue in and out of education overnight. Now, is that a left-right an idea or a right idea? They might sort it out over time and call it one thing or another, but at the moment, we've got a cycle where new ideas aren't yet sort of owned.
Okay, so politics is expensive.
As I'm learning.
It's expensive just to run for the LA school board. So what you've done so much work on this, what do you estimate is going to need to be raised in order to, you're going to have to get every state, as you pointed out before, et cetera. What do you think, what kind of dough
What kind of dough
what
are we talking about? Where is it coming
to get
from?
This done?
Yeah. The good news here is actually that, again, this is a relatively light lift. Now, not to underestimate what is going on, but ballot access, there are laws, ballot access on every state, so the thresholds are known. It's roughly about 865,000 signatures nationwide to get on the ballot in all 50 states. For comparison, that is less signatures than it takes to get a ballot initiative in California. It takes like 1.2 million signatures to get a ballot initiative in California. It's going to take 865,000 signatures nationwide to get on the ballot. So relatively, this is manageable. Now, it's beyond me. I have self-financed this up to this point. We just went live with the website and video and campaign just a few weeks ago and have begun grassroots fundraising on this. Roughly, to take this into 2020 all the way, now a national campaign, it's tens of millions of dollars.
Okay. Well, we have a little time left. I just thought I'd actually see this is such an unusual endeavor that David is embarking on, and I think it represents how much he cares about this country. And what I would say is, if he's as successful a politician as you are an entrepreneur, then we haven't seen the last of you. So I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions for David about kind of this endeavor. Yep.
How did you lose the right in the first place? I know that
Yeah.
that's how I saw Hamilton. I'm sorry. I saw Hamilton, and I remember in the play they talk about this, that they're going to change the rules as to who gets to be the vice president. I mean, how did it really happen?
I'm glad you asked. I will try and answer just as quickly as I can, but it's a really worthy question. Initially, the selection was you couldn't vote for the VP. You could only vote for president, and whoever came in second place became president. Washington, Adams, Jefferson and Burr ran and tied, per Hamilton the play. Alexander Hamilton was able to convince enough Federalists to eventually, it was 33 votes or something that it went to before he was finally able to convince enough people to vote for Jefferson. He becomes president, Burr, vice president. It was acrimonious. We have sort of this old wives' tale that because they were from opposite parties, that's why we moved. No, it's because they tied. Jefferson said this could break our republic. We will create a separate office, separate and distinct. We got the 12th Amendment. After the 12th Amendment, it calls for a distinct ballot and a distinct vote. We could vote, go and vote for the vice president. Now, I didn't appreciate any of this. To us, voting equals ballots. America didn't get a ballot until 1890, and we took the ballot from Australia. How do you even vote without a ballot? Good question. Yays and nays, beans, rocks, we did all sorts of things, but the most common of which was boxes. Go and write anyone's name in a box and drop it in the box. The invention of then the party ballot, not a ballot you're voting with, but they would stand outside the polling places, which were public. We earned the right to a private ballot later. They were public, and they would write down, they had sheets of paper that had all the party candidates on it, and they were often colored paper. They would hand you a pink piece of paper with all of the party candidates so they could watch you as you went to drop names. They were like little tear sheets as you went to drop the names in the box. If you didn't vote party, they would beat you up afterwards. We got the party ballot before we got the Australian ballot. Australian ballot was introduced in 1890. Ballots are controlled by states. That's why there's no point in history to point to and say we lost the vice presidency in 1924. Because what happened was ballots are controlled by the states. So each state moved to it differently at different times in different ways. Because of the Electoral College, ballots initially didn't have candidates on it. It had the electors. States started introducing ballots with electors. You're voting for electors, not for candidates, and we still are, technically. But then it started, 1920 was the first time a presidential candidate's name showed up on a ballot. 1980 is the last time an elector was exposed on a ballot. Little turns of history, state by state, year by year. And then there's an evolution of party strength into nominees. FDR was the first to choose his running mate. By 1960, that would become the norm. No laws ever passed, no laws ever changed, no one ever asked. Tradition and time have, and ultimately it really started with the party ballot, has stolen the vice presidency from us.
Great question. I think you have a MOOC in you. I think we have to do a American voting MOOC. I think it is fascinating. All right. Well, I think we do one minute left, so we'll do real quickly. Yep.
Yeah, this should be quick anyway. I guess for the last 20 years, it's been raise money and advertise on TV, and then Trump won with Facebook disinformation and a ground game. Fire up the base rallies. What's your kind of campaign strategy? I assume it's like social media, but I doubt it's cat videos. Like, could be a MOOC. I don't know.
Yeah, again, right now we're building this bridge, and it's all about education, because we don't need to call for a new amendment. We got it. We don't need to call for new laws. We have them. This is about waking people up to our rights. And so it's really
I think Michael wants to know how you're going to win.
So it's digital. Sharing an idea is a lot easier than running a candidate. Right now, we've got to share this idea as fast and far and broad as we can. It's digital, it's social media. And if you go to, I'd be remiss, VICE.RUN, it is our website. It's got videos up on it. It's got white paper. It's got national polling and research. And would ask all of you, how do we affect this change? If you like what you heard today, go and pledge on VICE.RUN, and that is how we begin to make this real. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much.